Hello, and welcome to the Qualtrics Variables and Values training module. I am Paul Byrne, Research Data Services Librarian at Syracuse University Libraries. What we will cover in this module is question and variable numbering and naming, changing and labeling values, and previewing your results. Let's start with question and variable naming. By default, questions are numbered Q1, Q2, Q3, and so on. The columns or variables in your resulting data file will also be named in this manner. This question numbering scheme can and probably should be changed. This is because the question number or name will be used as a variable or column name when the data are exported. In particular, the question number can be changed to a name. This is especially useful if you have pre-written code with which to analyze your data. The resulting data file will already have the proper variable names, and you can just run your code. Otherwise, you will have to either edit your code to match your data, which is not recommended, or you will have to go back and change the variable names in your data anyhow. Question numbers or names by default are not shown on the survey. This of course can be changed, but if you have changed the number to a name, the respondent will see the name. Also, if you reorder the questions, the question numbers or names are not adjusted, so they will appear out of sequence. So if you really want the respondent to see a question number, you can always make it part of the question text. For these reasons, it's probably better not to let the respondent see the actual question numbers as they are in Qualtrics, and use a progress bar instead to let the respondent know how far along they are in your survey. Also, remember that instructional or descriptive text and images are treated as questions and are included as variables in the data. This is done so you can determine how long a respondent looked at the instructions, or to make sure that they actually did see it as they are supposed to. In these cases, it might be helpful to rename these consistently, like inst1, inst2, etc., to make them easy to find later on. Let's take a look at Qualtrics. Here we have a very basic survey in Qualtrics. Qualtrics will number your questions by default Q1, Q2, Q3, and so on in the order in which you create them. This includes if you insert a new question, it will just take the next number available, regardless of where you have put it within your survey. Additionally, let's take this out. If you move your questions around, it will not automatically renumber them. You have a couple of choices here. One is to come up to Tools and go to Auto Number Questions. And you can update the tags of all questions using sequential numbering, which is the default Q1, Q2, Q3. Block numbering, in which the questions within each block will start at 1. So you'll have block 1, question 1, block 2, question 1, etc. You can also use the internal ID numbering. Qualtrics gives a special ID to every single question created. I don't see where this would necessarily be particularly useful or where you might use it. You can also change the prefix from Q to whatever else you might want, up to 4 characters. You cannot use an uppercase V. This is because Qualtrics will insert some default variables that it creates, and it will use the capital V or the uppercase V as a prefix for those variables. You can use a lowercase v, but I wouldn't suggest doing this because some programs like SAS or SPSS do not use case-sensitive variable names, and it will get confused between the uppercase and the lowercase v's. So if you want to just go ahead and set this back to Q, if you just want to go ahead and renumber the questions properly, you just click on sequential numbering, and you can see it renumbers everything in the proper order. By default, Qualtrics does not show the question numbers in the actual survey. So the order of those may not be such a big thing, but when you go to output your data, it would be nice to have it in a reasonable order. If you want to, you can have Qualtrics show the question numbers to the respondents. To do this, you come up to Survey Options, and then click on Show Question Numbers. And save. And we can preview. And you can see now there's Q1, Q2, Q3, and so on. Another option you can do, and I strongly suggest doing this, is you can change the names of these questions and the variables that will be output with your data by simply clicking on the question number, and you get a little text box. It can be up to 8 characters long, and you cannot start with a number or use special characters except for an underscore within the variable name. Now, of course, if you are showing the question numbers, then your respondents will now see these new variable names, and that can be very confusing to them. So I usually recommend not showing the question numbers. If you really want them to see a 1, a 2, a 3, and so on, you can just make it part of the question itself. One, two. What I really recommend, however, is using a progress bar. And you can adjust this by going over to Look and Feel. And the default here is no progress bar. Let's scroll this down a little because that comes at the bottom. You can do with text, and it just shows 0% to 100%. Without text, and it's just the bar which will fill in as your respondent goes along. Or with verbose text, which simply says survey completion and the 2%. And let's look at our survey. Much nicer, correct? One quick note about changing the variable names in Qualtrics pertains to if you are using a published survey or psychology survey, etc., that already has certain variable names that have been used in their instructions or other materials that come with it, or even other published research. By changing the variable names to what they use, your survey will be more consistent with their instructions as well as with previously published research using the same survey or instrument. Additionally, a lot of published surveys or psychology instruments, etc., also come with pre-written code in SAS, SPSS, Stata, etc., where you will want to be using the same variable names as it is in the code. That way you will not have to either then rewrite the code, which I strongly recommend you do not do, so that it uses the variable names Q1, Q2, or having to go through your outputted SPSS file and changing the variable names in there. It's much easier and much more efficient to change the variable names as you create them to match the previous instructions or literature. Now let's talk about changing and labeling values. Just by way of definition, values are the numbers or text entered into the data file that you will analyze. Value labels are the descriptive text that software such as SPSS or Stata use to make their output easier to read. In Qualtrics, the value for each possible response is numbered from 1 to however many response options you have for a particular question. As you have suspected, the values and value labels can be changed. Let's take a look at Qualtrics again. To see what values and labels Qualtrics is using to enter the data and will output when you output your data, just come over here to the gear icon and select Recode Values. If you check the box here, you'll see these are the values that Qualtrics enters as people make their selections, and this is what will be output in your SPSS or Excel file. If you come over here and click on Variable Naming, this is the text that will be output if you are using SPSS. Now this variable naming is a little bit different in Qualtrics than in other programs such as SPSS or SAS. In SPSS or SAS and Stata, variable naming is exactly that. It's the name of the variable, as we have over here coffee or my planet. So that's where Qualtrics is a little bit different from everybody else. Now sometimes you don't want the default values that Qualtrics will put in here. Qualtrics will just number each response 1 through however many you have. So for something like I don't drink coffee, you might want to say 0. And of course for 1 cup, as you can see, all you need to do is just type in a new value in the box. You can use only whole numbers. You cannot use any letters or special characters. You can use negative numbers, however. You can change what in SPSS would be the value labels by just typing right in here. You come over and close. We'll look at what effect this has on the data in a moment. Now that you've made some changes, let's preview your results. You can always check what your data will look like by generating and exporting some test responses. You can generate test responses in the View Results tab under Advanced Options. You should still pilot test your survey by allowing others, preferably potential respondents, to fill it out. Let's take a look at Qualtrics. Once you've made all your changes in Qualtrics, you want to output some test or dummy data, just so that you can output it in Excel or SPSS, just to see what the data will look like once you do actually output the real data. To do this, you come up to Tools, and then down to Test Survey. Now this will, by default, automatically generate 5 responses. Usually you want a little bit more than that, so you can just go ahead and change it. There are some other options you can use: allow unanswered questions or show verbose output. Typically the defaults are just fine. Click on Start Test. It'll take a moment or two. I'll give you some information here about it. Then you can just go over here to Close. Now to look at that data that was just generated, come up here to Data and Analysis. And you can see some of your data here. See, there's 15 recorded responses, and you can go down. You can also come over here to Actions and view a response just to see the data that's been output, the default data. What you'll really want to do, however, is to export this to either Excel or SPSS if that's what you're using. Just come over here to Export Import, click on Export Data, and here you have 2 choices. The first is to download data table. Basically, that is what you see over here. It's not particularly useful in a general sense. What you'll want to do is use Legacy Export Format. Click on that. You have your choice of CSV, which is good for Excel or many other programs, XML, SPSS, HTML, fixed field, user submitted files. Most times you're going to be using either CSV or SPSS. Use the legacy view. You can restrict it to certain responses by response numbers. We are going to look at more options though. You can have numeric values, choice text. If you have a really large file, you want to have it compressed as a .zip file. That means that it will download more quickly. If you choose SPSS, you'll get another option called string width medium. I recommend just leaving this as it is unless you know that you have some really long text values. Once you've made all your choices, you can click on Download. Since this can take a couple of minutes, even with just a very small file like we have, I have already gone ahead and done that. And here in SPSS, we see we have our data view. Here across the top are all the variables that Qualtrics enters by default. The 3 variables that we made, and location variables that Qualtrics also puts in by default. If we click on Variable View, we can see for the variables that we entered, they use the question as the variable label, which is nice. And over here under Values, they've already created the value labels using the ones that we changed using the Recoding Values tool. Close this up. One thing that I recommend also is downloading the SPSS syntax file. This can be very useful if you need to make changes to your variable labels or your value labels and other things. Also, if you are required to publish your data, you may have to use the syntax file and what they call the corresponding data, which is just the raw data, to deposit into the archive. I always recommend downloading the syntax file. It's good documentation for your file and can make your life easier later on if you need to recreate your data or make some changes to it. One more note is that even if you're not using Excel or SPSS, say you want to use SAS or Stata or any number of other programs, don't let that deter you from downloading the SPSS file. Programs like SAS and Stata are pretty good about reading SPSS files. There are also programs such as Stat Transfer, which can convert from SPSS to a couple dozen other types of packages. So whether it's SPSS or CSV or Stata or SAS, that's not a big deal. You can always come to Research Data Services in the library and get help converting your data. So, in conclusion, changing the default question numbering or naming can make your resulting data file easier to process. Likewise, changing the default values and value labels can also make your data set easier to process. And finally, be sure to generate some test data and preview it to make sure your changes produced what you expected. Thank you. We welcome your comments and suggestions. Our contact information can be found on the web page.